Why repeating a thought makes it feel true. One of the most persuasive mistakes of the mind has nothing to do with evidence. It has to do with repetition. A thought appears once, and it may feel uncertain. It appears again, and it feels more familiar. It appears again, and now it begins to feel valid. Not because anything new was discovered, because repetition changed the feeling around it. This is what makes repeated thoughts so convincing. The mind starts to confuse familiarity with truth. A thought returns, and instead of asking, "Is this accurate?" the system begins to feel, "This must mean something if it keeps coming back." But recurrence is not proof. A thought can repeat for many reasons. Because it is unresolved, because it is emotionally charged, because it was linked to fear, memory, identity, or habit. None of that makes it true. It only makes it active. This is the mistake. The mind interprets activity as importance, and importance, when repeated enough, starts to feel like reality. This is why some thoughts gain power without gaining evidence. They return often, so they begin to sound like facts. Not because they were examined, because they were rehearsed. A repeated fear starts to feel like intuition. A repeated self-judgment starts to feel like honesty. A repeated doubt starts to feel like realism. The content may never have changed, only the level of familiarity changed. And familiarity has enormous persuasive force when the mind is tired, uncertain, or emotionally exposed. That is why repetition can quietly become a substitute for truth. What gives this pattern so much force is that repetition changes emotional tone. The first time a thought appears, it may feel questionable. The fifth time, it feels more settled. The 10th time, it can feel obvious. Not because the mind proved it, because the mind got used to hearing it. This is the danger. What is repeated enough stops sounding like a thought and starts sounding like a background truth. Something always there, something already known, something no longer needing to be tested. That shift happens quietly. The thought does not become stronger through evidence, it becomes stronger through ease of access. It is easier to think, easier to recall, easier to believe. And because it is easy, the mind mistakes it for accuracy. This is why repeated inner language matters so much. If the same interpretation keeps returning, the system begins to build around it, not because it is true, because it is available. A repeated thought starts shaping perception. Now attention looks for what confirms it. Memory selects what matches it. Emotion reinforces what fits it. And little by little, the thought no longer feels like one possibility among others. It feels like the lens itself. That is where repetition stops being harmless. It is no longer only a thought returning. It is a structure starting to organize experience around itself. This is why certain thoughts feel impossible to ignore. Not because they are important, because they are practiced. The system has moved through them so many times that they now carry the weight of familiarity. And familiarity creates a very specific illusion. It makes the thought feel self-evident. You stop hearing it as language. You start hearing it as recognition. Something like, yes, that's exactly it. Yes, that's the truth. Yes, that's what this always was. But what feels recognized is often only what has been repeated enough to stop feeling foreign. That is a crucial distinction, because once repetition is mistaken for truth, the mind becomes easier to organize around distortion. A repeated fear does not only return, it starts shaping expectation. A repeated judgment does not only echo, it starts shaping identity. A repeated doubt does not only visit, it starts shaping choice. This is how thoughts gain authority without ever being verified. They stop presenting themselves as ideas. They begin presenting themselves as reality already known. And when that happens, The thought no longer needs to persuade you actively. It only needs to keep returning. Each repetition makes resistance weaker. Each repetition makes examination less likely, because the thought now feels less like something to question and more like something to accept. That is the mechanism to notice. Not only what the thought says, but what repetition has done to its status. How something rehearsed slowly became something believed. What makes this even harder to notice is that repetition does not feel passive. It feels persuasive. The thought returns, and each time it returns, it arrives with less friction, less distance, less questioning, less interruption. It moves more easily through the system, and that ease is often misread as confirmation. The mind thinks, if this were not true, why would it keep coming back? But recurrence does not answer that question. A thought returns because it was reinforced, not because it was proven. Reinforced by attention, by emotion, by fear, by rehearsal, by the simple act of being revisited again and again. This is why repetition can make even weak thoughts feel structurally strong. Not because they contain more truth, because they occupy more space. And once a thought occupies enough space, alternatives start to fade. Other interpretations feel less natural, less available, less believable. Not because they are worse, because they were repeated less. This is where repetition quietly becomes authority. The thought is no longer just returning. It is beginning to dominate the field in which other thoughts would have to appear. And when one thought dominates the field, it does not need to be right. It only needs to be familiar enough to keep being followed. This is why repetition changes more than belief. It changes perception. Once a thought has been repeated enough, the mind stops meeting experience directly. It starts meeting experience through the thought. Now you do not only think this might be true, you begin to notice reality in ways that support it. A repeated fear makes danger easier to see. A repeated judgment makes failure easier to notice. A repeated doubt makes hesitation feel more justified. This is how thought moves from content to filter. It no longer appears only as something you hear. It becomes something you look through. And once that happens, the thought gains a kind of self-protection, because now the world itself seems to confirm it. Not objectively, selectively. Attention narrows, memory follows. Interpretation organizes itself around what was already repeated. This is why repetition can make distortion feel honest. Not because the mind is trying to lie, because the mind is trying to stabilize around what it knows best. And what it knows best is often not what is true. It is what has been practiced most. That is the real danger of repeated thought. Not only that it returns, that it slowly teaches the mind what to notice, what to ignore, and what to believe was always there. Once this is seen, the relationship with thought begins to change. Not because repetition stops, but because repetition is no longer confused with proof. A thought may still return, still sound familiar, still arrive with the weight of something already known. But now, its familiarity is understood differently, not as evidence, as rehearsal. That distinction matters, because once repetition loses its false authority, the thought becomes easier to examine, not to fight, not to suppress, to question. To ask, is this true or only repeated? That question interrupts the old mechanism. It weakens the automatic movement from recurrence to belief. And once that movement weakens, space returns. Not certainty, space. Enough space for other interpretations to appear. Enough space for the mind to stop treating the most repeated thought as the most reliable one. That is where clarity begins. Not when the thought disappears, when repetition stops being mistaken for truth. This is inner cognition.